Hello, everybody. Good morning. This is going to be a little standalone bonus episode on class. Feels like a podcast, though, since none of you are actually here watching me. So this is going to be a bonus class that's just going to be a kind of a side topic on the nature of language. So this is actually going to be a little bit different. I'll talk about this more in class. Also, I'm recording this before we actually meet on Tuesday, the 22nd, I believe. Yeah, I'm recording this before we meet on Tuesday, the 22nd. So if there's anything that I'm saying where you're like, why didn't he talk about this other thing he talked about in class? Well, it's because in my world, class hasn't happened yet. So hello, future people. So the point, though, is basically just to say a bit about what psychologists and philosophers mean when they're talking about language. Because reading the Fodor, you might be struck by there's a few unfamiliar terms. And so one of the things I want to do is highlight some of those terms, and talking through language is one of the more useful ways of doing that. And second, when we go a few classes down the line, we are going to be talking about Fodor's idea that there is a language of thought. And unless you know what a language is in general first, it can be hard to really wrap your head around what on earth he means by a language of thought. Also, if you hear an annoying noise in the background, somebody's cutting the lawn. I apologize. All right, so that's the first one. Why did we change the plan? Now, the first thing I want to talk about is a language versus language, because when people in our everyday lives talk about language, we usually have something in mind like Spanish or English or Mandarin Chinese or something that people speak out there in the world. But when philosophers and linguists use the word language, they mean something a bit more general. Rather than just one particular language, they have in mind the general things that all these languages have in common, what makes them all languages. And it's about the way in which language is used and can be used to represent the world. So it's about an abstract system of individual parts put together in certain ways that allow you to represent bigger things. So when philosophers and linguists use the term language, it's going to include all the things that we usually in our everyday life mean by language. So things like Spanish and French and Portuguese and Filipino and all the various Native American languages and all the many languages of Africa. So all the languages of Asia, all of these will fall under it, but it will also include things that, haven't yet been invented. So as English changes or as another language changes, it's also going to include those things. And it's also going to include abstract systems. Computer languages will count as a language in this sort of sense. So C++, Python, also something like this is going to count as a language. That's going to count as a sentence of a language or a string of symbols of a language on this general sense. So the question is, of course, then, what is it we're talking about when we're saying all of these are language? So just to be clear, language, we're talking about the more general category. A language has in mind a particular thing like C++ or English. So that's all we mean by language versus a language. Now, what is it that makes a language a language? Well, it's a particular type of representational system. It's a way of representing the world, and a very powerful, useful one. So to make sense of this, it's useful to say what on earth we mean by representation. So representation is one of those things which we all kind of have an intuitive understanding of, like this person represents the people from this state. We have representatives, they do representing. So what does it mean to talk about representing? Well, basically, all it is for something to be a representation is for one thing to stand in for another thing. So very often, the thing that's standing in for another thing, as we're going to be using in this class and in the context of mental, is you have something physical or something non-mental that stands in for something mental, or something mental that stands in for something non-mental. But here's just to give the general idea. This right here is a representation. What is this a representation of? Well, it's people standing next to a tall church. This is a representation of people standing next to a tall church. So all the representation is, it's a two-part thing in which you've got the representer and the represented. So in this case, the representer is just this drawing I've made of people standing next to a tall church. But what does it represent? Well, it represents, it's not just a drawing, it's also, because this isn't really a church, you couldn't go and hear a service here because it's a bunch of lines on a board. But it stands in for something else. What does it stand in for? Well, a possible state of affairs or a way the world could be, or to use our terminology from the last few classes, it's a representation of a proposition that people are standing next to a tall church. So if we're like, you know, if somebody cut my tongue out and I was trying to explain to you what I saw on my way here, I could draw and you'd know, oh, there were people standing next to a tall church. I was representing that state of affairs with this drawing. So the represented is just the content that is being stood in for. That's terrible. That's a lot of prepositions, but whatever. It's the thing that is being represented. So the representer represents the represented. This picture represents a church with a tall church with a bunch of people standing next to it. Each one of these represents a person. And this is another key. It doesn't just have to be with representation. You don't have to represent an entire state of affairs. You can also represent smaller things. So we could say that this represents a person, or we could even say it represents a particular person. Say, I don't know, Fred is there at the church. So this particular person represents Fred at the church. Sorry, I have to plug in my computer. So that's all that's meant by representation and representational. So just to talk again, the thing that we draw that represents something else, we talk about as the representer. And the thing it represents, we can talk about it either as the represented or the representational content. Now, talking in terms of representational content is useful because one interesting thing about representations is the same representational content can be represented by multiple different things. One last side note before we go on. This term representational content, philosophers very often refer to the exact same thing as intentional content. So if you see intentional content, and Fodor brings this up a lot, or intentionality, all he means by this is representationality and representational content. The reason that they use the term intentional has to do with some now dead French man in the 1800s borrowing words from Latin. It can be confusing because intentional here has a different meaning than intentional in the sense of, sorry, that light is pointing right at the board. Which light is it? That one. Okay, so this sense of intentional is different from the sense of I went to the store intentionally, like I meant to go there, or I intended to tie my shoe, but I messed up and then tripped it and fell over. It's a different sense of intentional. Intentional content in this sense just means aboutness, or whatever the content is that it's about. So again, talking in terms of representational content is useful because we can talk about the same representational content being represented by different representers. So there are people next to the tall church. Here's another way of representing the exact same thing. This is a picture, a pictorial representation of the content. There are people next to a tall church. This is a sentence that expresses the exact same representational content. There are people next to a tall church. In the same way, this word right here represents churches, as does this picture. Or this together all represents a tall church, just like this picture represents a tall church. So this is why we talk in terms of representational content. It makes it very useful to talk about the things which are shared between different representers or different types of representations, because it's not just written language and pictures, it's also spoken language. It's also even things like sound. Like I could represent speed Am I representing fast or slow right now? I'm going to talk really, 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 versus that's using sound to represent speed. I'm using the speed with which I'm making noise as a representation of something more general, namely fastness or slowness. So that's all that we mean by representation and representational. And again, this notion of intentional content, or to say it has intentionality. This sentence has intentionality. There's something this sentence is about. This picture has intentionality. There's something this picture is about. It's about something that could happen. Not necessarily did, but it's something that you can think, is it true? If I asked you to draw what you did this yesterday on Sunday, and you went to church at a tall church and you drew this, it could be true that this represents what you did. Or if you didn't go to church, then this would be a bad representation, a false representation of what you did yesterday. But that's generally what we're talking about with representation and representational content. Now, with this background in mind, we can bring in language. And what language is a very, very powerful, very important and powerful representational system. So one thing that makes language much more powerful than something like this is I had to draw this before class because it took me a while. This took me, I mean, granted, I'm a terrible artist and I wanted to get it so it actually looked like a church, but it probably took me about 3 minutes. It took me about, what, 20 seconds to write this. So language is a representational system that you can express things much more quickly. Also, language is a very flexible representational system. So unlike drawing, where to draw something, it has to be pretty, you know, the sort of thing you could see, I could say something along the lines of primogeniture was a popular form of inheritance. Just erase this. In the Middle Ages. So, primogeniture was a popular form of representation or of inheritance in the Middle Ages. So first off, what does primogeniture mean? Well, it's a form of inheritance in which you, when a parent dies, the oldest child gets everything. That's all it means. It was popular. It's still very popular amongst royal families. It's to keep everything in the family. One person gets everything. Specifically, the oldest person gets everything. So primogeniture was a popular form of inheritance in the Middle Ages. How on earth would you represent this if in any form other than language? How would you draw primogeniture? Just think about, there's a reason Pictionary is a party game, because it's really funny and there are lots of things that are really, really difficult to draw. Or I'm sure if you were at all like me and you didn't see anyone during COVID, you were playing the Drawful game online. Same sort of idea. The reason why language is so powerful is it allows us to represent things that would be very, very difficult to represent in any form other than language. And it allows us to do it very, very quickly. Think about how fast a person can talk and how quickly they can get an entire story across. So that's the power of language. Now, how is it that language is able to do that? What is it about language that allows you to express things that have never been thought before even? Because remember, a couple classes ago, in the last one of these recordings, I talked about, or 2 recordings ago, I talked about the fact that certain sentences, you can understand them, but they've never been uttered before. They've never been thought before. How is that possible? Well, here's the key of what a language is. It's a way of using a finite set of parts combined with a finite set of rules that allows you to express infinitely many representational contents. So the idea is that by taking just a couple of parts and a couple of rules for combining those parts, you can get infinitely many representational contents. And the reason for that is that language is a compositional system whereby larger parts or larger constructions can be calculated and understood entirely on the basis of their parts and how those parts are put together. And the rules for putting the parts together are such that the combinations you get by putting the parts together are something more than you get just by mixing them. So that was a whole bunch of terms. I'm now going to unpack them and say what they mean. So I'm going to erase my beautiful church. Goodbye, church. So the key words I want to put up here are compositional and what's the best way of putting this? Discrete parts with, yeah, let's just go with discrete parts. So what do I mean by this? Well, first off, for something to be composite, why did it just get blurry? Come back to me. Camera, I'm here. Sorry, it just got blurry on me. I don't know why it decided to do that. Does that help? You're supposed to autofocus. There we go. All right, so what do we mean to say something is compositional? Well, all it means is the nature of a whole is defined entirely by the nature of the parts and the particular ways they're put together. So things like DNA is a compositional system because in DNA, each little, what an entire gene is like is defined entirely on which of those, which of the nucleotide bonds it involves or which ones are bound together and what order they're in, and how many of them there are. In the same way with language, if you know what words are in a sentence and how those words are arranged or what endings they have in other languages, you'll be able to know exactly what the overall sentence is like. So for instance, a bear bit George. As long as you know what George means, bear means, how to use and what bit means, you'll be able to figure this out. You don't need anything over and above this to understand what the sentence is. You don't have to bring in outside information. As long as you know what the parts mean and you know the rules by which they're combined together, you understand the sentence. And now the other difference tied in with this is the parts themselves are unique, discrete parts. They're unique wholes. So by discrete, I mean they exist entirely by themselves. They're full units. So George is one full unit. Bit is one full unit. Bear is one full unit. So if you take paint and you combine red paint and blue paint, they mix together entirely. And when they mix, you get what's halfway between them. They don't remain discrete and whole. In this way, in a sentence though, it's not like when you combine George and a bear on the same sentence, you get something that's like George had a child with a bear. It's not like you get a George-bear mixture. Rather, you get George and a bear, and they're kept apart. And then on top of that, bit tells you what to do in the middle. So this is the general idea of how a language is structured. Now, the keys then for explaining its real representational power is the fact that language has semantics and syntax. So semantics is just a really fancy way of saying meanings. And so the reason that language is such a powerful tool is that each individual part has a certain meaning. So for instance, George means whatever it is that allows it to be used to talk about George. So maybe it's just George or a meaning associated with him. Bit it's got a meaning. So that's what bit means. Bear, again, it refers to bears, or it's got a meaning that allows it to be used to talk about bears. So each of these, and we say the semantics of each of these is just its meaning. So each of these right here has a semantic content that allows it, so semantic content. So basically, semantic content, or when we're talking about semantics, we're just talking about the representational content possessed by a particular word. So, or a particular language. Semantic is really the fancy way of talking about representational contents and intentionality in the context of language. It's just a more precise sort of representational content. So George has semantic content. Bit has semantic content. Bear has semantic content. So if you know, and you might ask, what's the semantic content of a? Well, it's complicated. It's got to do with being a signifier that there's a single one of a certain thing. But here's the general idea, is each part has semantic content. So if you know the semantic content of that part, you know how to use that part in many numbers of sentences. So if I say a bear bit George, well, you're also then going to be able to put in any other number of words here and still understand it, because you still understand a bear and bit. You can have a bear bit me, a bear bit you, a bear bit Steve, a bear bit Obama. All of these you can understand because you already know this. So as long as you have this understood, the semantics of this one and the semantics of this one, then you can use it over and over and over again. So even if you've never seen the particular sentence, a bear bit Obama, you're able to figure it out because you know what Obama means, you know what bit means, and you know what bear means. So just by learning these particular parts, you're able to build up and get very large understandings and express many different things, many representational contents with a finite set of parts. So in this way, you can make something that is infinite because, again, the number of sentences a human being can express is genuinely infinite, except for time constraints. So if you were to live forever, you could keep saying new things forever. But in this particular case, what we're showing is that just by these finite number of parts, you get infinite amounts. And the fact that each part is meaningful is what allows the system to be so powerful and representationally complex and very useful for expressing large amounts of information. Now, the other key part of language, and this isn't really going to tell you entirely how to get larger, the semantics alone doesn't tell you how to get full-size representational contents, because thus far I've just been talking about the parts, but I haven't actually said anything about how do you know how the parts go together. Well, this is where syntax comes in. Syntax is just a set of rules in a language that tells you how to get larger structures out of the smaller parts. They tell you which ones can be put together in such a way that it remains meaningful, and tells you how you're supposed to understand the things that are picked out by the meanings, or things you mean using those words, how they relate to each other. So to take a very simple answer or example, 3 plus 4 equals 7. Math has a very particular syntax. It tells you that if you put two numbers separated by a symbol, you take the first one of those, the one to the left, and then do a particular operation on it using this one here. So in this case, you start with the number 3. The semantics of this symbol is the number 3. The semantics of this symbol is the number 4. And the semantics of this symbol is the function or the mathematical operation of addition. So when you write this down, you're saying start with the number 3, then upon 3, perform the function of addition, and how much are you adding? 4. So the ordering of these numbers tells you the syntax. In the same way, this also tells you that whatever's to the left of this equal sign is going to be 1 unit, and it's going to be equivalent to whatever's on the right. The equivalence comes here, but the fact that you're comparing right and left is part of the syntax of math. Now, going to an English language sentence, a bear bit me. This has a certain structure. You know, if you're an English speaker, that the thing to the left over here is going to be the subject. Then you've got the bit in the middle, which is the verb. And then you've got the object, which, let's say in this case, is George. Let's go back to George. So how do you know that in this case? Well, there's rules that say the thing to the left is the thing that's doing, or the thing that is the subject of this action. And then the thing to the right is a thing that this is acting upon. And just by knowing this general rule, you can put in many different things. So we could also say, George bit a bear. it doesn't take rocket science. You know, because you already knew how to put a bear bit George together, you are able to figure out how to put George bit a bear together. Just because there's one particular rule. So with one rule and only 1, 2, 3, 4 words, we're immediately able to express multiple different concepts. And the interesting thing is this can go on forever. And that one rule could also be used to say, I bit George. I bit a bear. I punched a bear. And so with this one structure, you're able to put in all the many different parts you know, and thereby express many, many different representational contents. And so the rules that you learn and the rules you follow that allow you to know how to get the bigger meanings out of the smaller ones, that's the syntax of a language. And the semantics are the things that, it's the meaning. So each part has a semantics, and then the semantics of the whole, the meaning of the whole thing is a matter of the semantics of the parts combined together in accordance with the rules of the syntax. Now, this is going to be coming up again and again throughout the semester. So if this didn't make 100% sense yet, it'll come up again and again, as I said, so don't worry about it. I'll be talking about syntax, semantics, meanings, representations, and languages a lot more. But when we're talking about footer, it's very useful to talk about these general things. So to summarize, any sort of system in which one thing is standing in for another thing is representational, or it has representational content, or to use the fancy philosophy term, it has intentional content. Now, there are many different ways you can represent. One of them is a language. And in a language, the key is that you have a bunch of discrete units, each of which has its own representational content, its own semantic content that exists on its own and is a certain thing. And if you know that, then you know what the semantics of that word are, what it can be used to talk about, or what it symbolizes, what it represents. To know the semantics is to know what that word represents. Then a language also has a syntax, and it's a set of rules whereby those individual semantically contentful parts can be combined together into larger contents. And specifically, it's a finite set of rules. There's not infinitely many different rules in a language. There are also combinations that are wrong. So for instance, if I had said a bit bear George, I mean, you might be able to figure out what on earth that meant. If I said a bit bear George, you'd figure out like George might be a bear that a bit, or there was a bear and it bit George. Like you can get some meaning out of it, but you also know that it's much harder because the set syntactic rules, there are a small number of them that tell you what's acceptable and what's not in a language. And the interesting thing about syntax is not only does it give you the power to, with relatively few rules, to understand many things, these rules can be combined with each other. So if you know a bear bit George, you could then say, and a swan attacked Susie, or a bear bit George and Susie, or a bear and George bit Susie and another bear. All of these, with those finite rules, you can combine them together. So the syntax is the rules that allow you to take these finite sets of meaningful parts and construct infinitely many larger meaningful constructions. Now, to finish off, there's a lot of unanswered questions at this point. For instance, where do these rules come from? Who sets them for a language like something like English? Another one is, how do we learn these rules? How do we know that a bear bit George is, to speak using language terms, grammatical? Another one is, how on earth does representation happen? How is it that like these little marks on a page or on a whiteboard are able to pick out or have a semantic content of bear? What does it mean for a mark on a board to be about something? These are all brilliant, great, complex questions. And a lot of these are the questions that are going to come up again and again throughout. If you're a psychology major, they come up a lot, over and over again. If you're a philosopher, these questions are things that people have been dealing with since, before Plato. Also, these are just things that are going to come up again and again this semester where we ask, well, okay, but how does a bear, like how does, this is literally speaking, just some blue expo marker on a whiteboard. And yet there's some sense in which it's about bears, which, you know, are big, rah, furry things. So how does that work? Again, these are great questions which we're going to have to ask throughout the semester. But in order to ask them, we need to have the right tools and terms to be able to frame our questions and to understand how it all fits together. And that's what today's goal was, to talk about how to get the terms, the notions of syntax, semantics, intentionality, representation, to talk about what the big questions and what the problems are for trying to understand how humans work, how our minds work, and how we're able to talk about, understand, think about things that aren't in front of us right now. All right, I will see you all in a little bit.